My name is Margaret Reynolds, and at 68 years old, I never imagined I'd be standing in the pouring rain outside my son Thomas's house with nothing but a small suitcase. After 40 years of sacrificing everything for him, he chose his mother-in-law Diane over me. I watched through the window as she moved into my room, taking my place in my son's home and life. What Thomas, Stephanie, and Diane never expected was that this broken-hearted mother still had a few cards left to play. I'd love to know where you're watching from today. If you're enjoying this story about family betrayal and unexpected justice, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more real stories like mine. Trust me, what happened next changed everything about our family forever. I became a single mother when Thomas was only 3 years old. His father, Richard, decided family life wasn't exciting enough and left us for his 22-year-old secretary. The divorce left me with nothing but a 3-year-old boy, a mountain of debt, and a determination to give my son the best life possible despite our circumstances. Those early years were incredibly difficult. I worked 3 jobs just to keep a roof over our heads. During the day, I worked as a receptionist at a local dentist's office. Evenings, I waited tables at a diner near our apartment. Weekends, I cleaned houses for wealthy families in the nicer part of town. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. Despite the exhaustion, Thomas was always my priority. I remember falling asleep while reading him bedtime stories, only to have him gently pat my face saying, "Wake up, Mommy, you didn't finish the story." No matter how tired I was, I always found the energy to finish that story. I put my own dreams on hold indefinitely. I'd been halfway through nursing school when Richard left, but continuing my education seemed impossible with a child to raise and bills to pay. Instead, I channeled all my ambitions into Thomas, determined that he would have every opportunity I couldn't have. During Thomas's childhood, we were inseparable. I never missed a little league game or a school performance, even if it meant swapping shifts or working overtime to make up for it later. I packed special lunches with notes tucked inside. I helped with science fair projects and stayed up late quizzing him before big tests. Thomas was a bright child, curious and kind. His teachers always commented on his empathy and willingness to help others. The teenage years were surprisingly smooth. Unlike many of his friends, Thomas never went through a rebellious phase. He maintained good grades, played baseball, and even started a tutoring program for younger students. I was so proud of him, of the young man he was becoming despite growing up without a father. When Thomas was accepted to State University with a partial scholarship, I cried tears of joy. We had done it. Despite all the odds, my son was going to college. I took on extra shifts to help cover what the scholarship didn't, determined that he wouldn't start his adult life burdened with student loans as so many of his peers would. It was during his sophomore year at college that Thomas met Stephanie. He brought her home during spring break, and I tried my best to be welcoming. Stephanie was pretty and polite, but there was a reserve about her that I couldn't quite penetrate. She smiled at the right times and said all the right things, but I never felt I was seeing the real person behind the careful facade. "Mom, Stephanie's family is really important to her," Thomas explained after that first visit. "They're very close-knit and traditional." I later learned that traditional was code for controlling. Stephanie's mother, Diane, had very specific ideas about how families should function, with herself at the center of everything. From the beginning, there seemed to be an unspoken competition between Diane and me, one that I hadn't signed up for and didn't understand. The warning signs were subtle at first. Thomas would cancel our weekly phone calls because he was having dinner with Stephanie's family. Holiday traditions that we'd maintained throughout his childhood were suddenly negotiable. Stephanie always seemed to have a prior commitment whenever I suggested spending time just the 3 of us. By the time Thomas and Stephanie announced their engagement after college graduation, Thomas had changed. The empathetic, kind-hearted boy I'd raised was becoming increasingly materialistic and status-conscious. Stephanie's family was wealthy, old money from her father's side, and Thomas seemed eager to prove he belonged in their world. "You should see their house, Mom," he told me excitedly after meeting her parents. "It's like something out of a magazine, and Mr. Peterson has connections everywhere. He's already talking about helping me get started in finance." I smiled and congratulated him, swallowing my concern. Who was I to stand in the way of his happiness and success? If Stephanie and her family could give him opportunities I never could, shouldn't I be grateful? The wedding was elaborate and expensive, with Diane micromanaging every detail. My role was minimized to mother of the groom, which apparently meant smiling politely and staying out of the way. I wore the dress Diane suggested and sat where I was told, watching my son marry into a family that seemed determined to erase his past. After the wedding, the distance between Thomas and me grew. Holidays were spent with Stephanie's family. Phone calls became shorter and less frequent. The Thomas I knew, who would talk to me for hours about his hopes and dreams, was replaced by a man who seemed perpetually busy and distracted. Little did I know then how much worse things would get, or how thoroughly Diane would work to replace me in my son's life. When Stephanie announced she was pregnant just a year after the wedding, I was overjoyed. A grandchild. Despite the growing distance between Thomas and me, surely a baby would bring us closer together. I began knitting blankets and buying small gifts, imagining myself as the doting grandmother I'd never had growing up. Emily was born on a beautiful spring morning. Thomas called from the hospital, his voice thick with emotion. "Mom, she's perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and Stephanie is doing great." I rushed to the hospital with my arms full of gifts, only to find Diane already installed in a chair by Stephanie's bedside, holding my newborn granddaughter. She barely acknowledged my arrival, too busy instructing Thomas on the proper way to swaddle a baby. "Mom taught kindergarten for 30 years, Stephanie explained weakly from the bed. "She knows everything about children." That set the tone for my relationship with my granddaughter. Whenever I offered advice or tried to help, Diane would contradict me or suggest a better way of doing things. When I mentioned the techniques that had worked with Thomas as a baby, Diane would smile thinly and say, "Well, childcare has advanced significantly since then." Jackson was born 2 years after Emily, and the pattern continued. I was allowed to visit, but never to truly participate. Diane had established herself as the authority on childcare, and Thomas and Stephanie deferred to her on everything. As the children grew, Thomas's career flourished. He had indeed gone into finance with his father-in-law's help and was making more money than I could have imagined. They moved to a larger house in an exclusive neighborhood. Each time I visited, the house seemed to contain more expensive furniture and artwork. Thomas became increasingly focused on appearances and status. The warm, empathetic boy I'd raised was becoming a man who measured success in material terms. Our conversations, when we had them, revolved around his latest acquisition or investment. When I tried to steer the conversation toward more meaningful topics, he would check his watch or phone, suddenly remembering an important call he had to make. Diane, meanwhile, was cementing her position as the dominant grandmother. She attended every school event, frequently picked the children up from school, and hosted elaborate birthday parties. When Emily was 5, I overheard her referring to Diane as Grandma and me as Grandma Margaret, as though I were some distant relation rather than her father's mother. When I gently mentioned this to Thomas, he sighed impatiently. "Mom, Diane spends more time with the kids. It's natural they'd be closer to her. If you want a closer relationship, maybe you should make more of an effort." I swallowed my hurt. I had been making an effort, but every attempt was subtly undermined. If I bought the children gifts, they were deemed not educational enough or too stimulating before bedtime. If I offered to babysit, there was always some reason why it wasn't convenient. When I suggested taking the children for a weekend, Stephanie would laugh nervously and say they were still too young for sleepovers. The situation worsened after my husband Robert passed away. Robert and I had married when Thomas was in high school. Though not Thomas's biological father, Robert had been a wonderful stepfather and grandfather. His death after a brief battle with cancer left me devastated and alone. With Robert gone, the house we'd shared felt too big, too empty. At the same time, the housing market was booming, and my financial advisor suggested it might be a good time to sell and downsize to a condo or apartment. During one of my increasingly rare dinners with Thomas's family, I mentioned my plans to sell the house. "Where will you go?" Thomas asked, seeming genuinely concerned for the first time in years. "I'm looking at some condos near the community college," I explained. "I might finally finish that nursing degree." Thomas exchanged a glance with Stephanie that I couldn't interpret. "Why don't you stay with us while you're looking? The guest room is just sitting empty, and it would give you time to find the perfect place instead of rushing." The offer seemed so kind, so reminiscent of the thoughtful son I'd raised, that I accepted without hesitation. We agreed I would move in after the house sold, with the understanding that the arrangement would be temporary, perhaps 6 months, while I found a new home. The first few weeks went relatively smoothly. I tried to make myself useful without overstepping, helping with meal preparation and occasionally watching the children when asked. I was careful to respect their routines and rules, even when they differed from what I would have done. Gradually, however, the atmosphere changed. Stephanie became increasingly cold, often speaking to me only when absolutely necessary. The children were too busy for the story times I tried to establish. Thomas worked later and later, sometimes not returning until after I'd gone to bed. Small incidents began to accumulate. Family photos were taken while I was at the grocery store. Dinner plans were made without consulting me. I would enter rooms to find conversations abruptly halting. One evening, I came downstairs for a glass of water and overheard Thomas and Stephanie talking in the kitchen. "I didn't think she'd be here this long," Stephanie was saying. "It's been 4 months already." "What am I supposed to do?" Thomas replied. "She's my mother. I can't just throw her out." "Your mother or not, she's becoming a burden." The children are confused about who's in charge, and Mom feels like she can't visit properly with Margaret always around. "Mom will be here this weekend," Thomas said. "Let's try to make it work. Margaret will find a place soon." I crept back upstairs, my water forgotten, tears stinging my eyes. A burden. That's what I had become to my own son. The woman who had sacrificed everything for him now wasn't welcome in his home. Little did I know that the worst betrayal was yet to come. If you've ever felt pushed aside by family, you're not alone. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Has anyone else experienced family members choosing others over you? Let me know while I continue sharing how this painful situation unfolded. I was reading in my room one Thursday afternoon when I heard the front door open, followed by excited voices and the sound of suitcases being rolled across the hardwood floor. Curious, I made my way downstairs to find Thomas, Stephanie, and the children clustered around Diane, who was directing movers with several large suitcases and boxes. "Grandma Diane is moving in," Emily announced excitedly, bouncing on her toes. I froze on the last step, confused. "Moving in? I didn't know you were planning a visit, Diane." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to me as though they'd forgotten my existence. Thomas cleared his throat uncomfortably, while Stephanie suddenly became very interested in organizing the children's backpacks. "Mom," Thomas said finally, gesturing toward his office. "Can we talk privately for a moment?" I followed him, a sense of dread building in my stomach. The moment the door closed behind us, Thomas adopted what I recognized as his business face, the carefully neutral expression he used when delivering difficult news to clients. "Mom, we need to make some changes to the living arrangements," he began, his tone professionally detached. "Diane's apartment building is undergoing major renovations, and they've asked all tenants to vacate for a few months." "And she's moving in here?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Yes. The thing is, we don't have enough space for everyone. The guest room is the only option, and since Diane will need somewhere to stay for at least 3 months, the implication hung in the air between us." "You want me to move out?" I said flatly. It wasn't a question. Thomas had the grace to look uncomfortable, but he nodded. "We think it's for the best. You've been talking about finding your own place for months now, and this gives you a definite timeline." "A timeline?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need you to move out within 2 weeks, Thomas said, not meeting my eyes. "Diane will be staying in a hotel until then, but it's quite expensive, and with the renovations costing her so much already." I felt as though I'd been punched in the stomach. 2 weeks? "Thomas, you know how difficult the housing market is right now. I've been looking, but everything in my price range gets snatched up immediately. I need more time." "I'm sorry, Mom, but we've already committed to Diane. Her hotel is only booked for 2 weeks. His voice had the rehearsed quality of someone who had anticipated all possible objections. "Besides, Diane is really helpful around the house. She cooks meals, the kids actually eat, helps with their homework, and knows exactly how Stephanie likes things organized." The implication was clear. Unlike Diane, I wasn't useful enough to keep around. "Thomas," I said, my voice breaking, "I'm your mother. I raised you alone. I worked 3 jobs so you could have opportunities. Does that count for nothing now?" For a moment, something like shame flickered across his face, quickly replaced by irritation. "That was a long time ago, Mom. I appreciate everything you did, but that doesn't mean we owe you indefinite housing. This arrangement was always meant to be temporary, remember? Temporary, yes, but with reasonable notice, I protested. 2 weeks isn't reasonable. Where am I supposed to go? Thomas shrugged, already turning toward the door. Maybe you could stay with a friend until you find a place? Or there are those senior apartments near the community center. Senior apartments. As though I were some doddering old woman who needed supervised care. Not a perfectly capable 6-8-year-old who had been managing her own life quite successfully until recently. When we returned to the living room, Diane was directing the movers about where to place her things that would apparently be taking up residence in my room in 2 weeks. She caught my eye and had the audacity to smile sympathetically. "Margaret, I hope this isn't too inconvenient for you," she said, her tone suggesting it shouldn't be. "It's just such a difficult situation with the renovations." "When did you find out about these renovations, Diane?" I asked quietly. Her hesitation told me everything. "About 3 months ago," she admitted finally. 3 months. They had been planning this for 3 months, all while I continued searching for a place, unaware that there was now a deadline to my welcome. Later that evening, I overheard Stephanie talking to Diane in the kitchen. "I'm so glad it worked out," Stephanie was saying. "The kids will be thrilled to have you here all the time." "It's for the best," Diane replied. "Margaret has been here far too long already. It's not healthy for her to be so dependent on Thomas." Dependent? I had never been dependent on anyone in my life. I had supported myself and my son through the hardest of circumstances. I had recently lost my husband and sold my home. Seeking temporary shelter with family was hardly dependency. The next morning, Thomas left an envelope on the kitchen counter before leaving for work. Inside was a check for $5,000 with a note, "To help with your new place. T." The money wasn't the issue. I had savings, and Robert's life insurance had left me reasonably comfortable. It was the dismissal that hurt, the cold calculation that my son could simply write a check and consider his obligation to his mother fulfilled. That afternoon, I called my friend Susan, barely managing to explain the situation before breaking down in tears. "Pack a bag," Susan said immediately. "You're staying with me until we figure this out." 2 days later, I moved most of my belongings into Susan's spare bedroom. Thomas helped carry my suitcases to the car, maintaining an awkward silence throughout. As I was about to leave, I saw Diane's car pull into the driveway. She got out, carrying shopping bags full of groceries, and gave me a small wave as though we were casual acquaintances parting after a pleasant visit. "I hope you find a nice place soon, Margaret," she called as she headed toward the front door. The door to what had been my temporary home but would now be hers. I looked back at my son, standing uncomfortably by my car. "Goodbye, Thomas," I said quietly. He nodded, already turning back toward the house. "Let me know when you're settled somewhere." As I drove away, I saw in my rearview mirror that he was helping Diane with her groceries, both of them laughing at something she said. In that moment, I realized a painful truth. My son had chosen his mother-in-law over his own mother. What neither of them knew was that this betrayal wouldn't be the end of our story, but rather the beginning of a reckoning none of them saw coming. The first few weeks at Susan's were a blur of grief and disbelief. I spent most days in bed, replaying the past months in my head, searching for signs I'd missed. Things I could have done differently. Susan, bless her heart, brought me cups of tea and sat with me, listening as I cycled through hurt, anger, and confusion. "I just don't understand," I told her one evening. "Thomas was always such a compassionate child. How could he treat me this way?" "People change," Susan said gently, "especially when they're trying to impress others." After 2 weeks of wallowing, Susan had enough. She marched into the guest room one morning and threw open the curtains, flooding the room with sunlight. "That's it, Margaret. Pity party's over. You're going to shower, get dressed, and we're going to the grocery store. I need help carrying bags, and you need fresh air." I reluctantly agreed, though the thought of potentially running into someone I knew and having to explain my situation was mortifying. As fate would have it, while selecting tomatoes in the produce section, I heard someone call my name. Looking up, I saw Barbara Thompson, who lived 3 houses down from Thomas. "Margaret, I haven't seen you around the neighborhood lately," she said, pushing her cart alongside mine. "I've been staying with a friend," I replied vaguely. Barbara lowered her voice. "Is everything okay at Thomas's? I've noticed some strange things happening over there." My curiosity piqued. "Strange how?" Barbara glanced around as though worried about being overheard in the nearly empty produce section. Well, there have been several men in suits visiting at odd hours. They look like the types who come to collect debts, if you know what I mean. And Thomas and Stephanie have been arguing a lot. I can hear them when I'm gardening. I didn't know, I said honestly. Thomas's financial situation had always seemed solid, at least from the outside. And that mother-in-law, Barbara continued, rolling her eyes. She's over there all the time now. I saw her writing a check to Thomas last week. A big one. From the look on her face, the pieces started clicking together in my mind. Diane wasn't just moving in because of convenient timing with her apartment renovations. There was something more going on. Barbara, have you heard anything specific about Thomas's business? I asked. She hesitated. Just rumors. My husband plays golf with someone from Thomas's firm. Apparently, there was a bad investment, something about a development project that fell through. Some clients lost a lot of money. On the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about what Barbara had said. Was Thomas in financial trouble? Had that been the real reason for pushing me out and bringing Diane in? Susan, I said when we returned home, I need to find out what's going on with Thomas's business. And how do you plan to do that? Susan asked, unloading groceries. I thought for a moment. Martin Williams, your banking friend from the country club? I nodded. Martin had been a friend of Robert's, and we'd maintained the friendship after Robert's death. He was discreet, but knowledgeable about the local business community. Over lunch the following day, I carefully broached the subject with Martin. I'm worried about Thomas, I said truthfully. There might be some financial issues, but he won't talk to me about them. Martin studied me for a moment. Margaret, you know I can't discuss specific client information. I'm not asking for details from the bank, I assured him. Just, if you've heard anything through the grapevine. Martin sighed. The grapevine has been quite active regarding Peterson Finance, he admitted, referring to the firm where Thomas worked under his father-in-law. There was a significant investment in a development project in the southern part of the county. The environmental permits fell through, and a lot of money vanished overnight. Thomas's money? I asked. Thomas's and his clients', Martin confirmed. The rumor is that he leveraged himself heavily on this one, convinced it was a sure thing. When it failed, he trailed off, his expression grim. How bad is it? Bad enough that there's talk of legal action from some of the clients. Bad enough that Peterson himself has apparently washed his hands of the whole affair, saying Thomas acted without proper authorization. I felt sick. Thomas had always been cautious with money growing up, understanding its value after watching me stretch every dollar. What had happened to that careful young man? Over the next week, I did more digging. I discovered that Thomas had taken a second mortgage on his house 6 months earlier. I learned that his business credit line was maxed out. Most shocking of all, I found out that he had borrowed against the investment account I had established for the grandchildren's education. The picture that emerged was of a man drowning in debt, desperate enough to turn to family for rescue. But not to me, to Diane. Barbara confirmed it when I ran into her again. That mother-in-law has practically moved in, she said. And yesterday I overheard her telling someone on the phone that she had mortgaged her house to help the kids. Can you imagine? I could indeed imagine it. Diane had found the perfect way to make herself indispensable, financial rescue. No wonder Thomas had been so quick to choose her over me. She was literally keeping his business afloat and his family in their home. But there was one detail that still didn't make sense. When I'd moved in with Thomas temporarily, I had mentioned to him that I was considering investing some of my savings from the house sale until I found a new place. I had even shown him the account statements while discussing options with him. With growing suspicion, I called my financial advisor. Jeffrey, I need to check if there have been any unusual transactions in my accounts over the past 6 months. There was a pause, followed by typing sounds. Margaret, there was a wire transfer of $50,000 to Peterson Finance Consultants 4 months ago. It's marked as an investment in their South Ridge Development Fund. My blood ran cold. I never authorized that transaction. More typing. I have the paperwork here. It has your signature on it. Send me a copy immediately, I demanded. When I saw the document, I knew instantly. The signature was similar to mine, but with subtle differences. Thomas had forged my signature to access my retirement funds. My own son had stolen from me. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. Not only had Thomas chosen Diane over me, not only had he thrown me out of his home, but he had actually committed fraud against me. He had taken the money I'd saved for my future without my knowledge or consent. In that moment, something hardened inside me. The hurt and confusion of the past weeks crystallized into a cold, clear resolve. This wasn't just about being displaced by a manipulative mother-in-law anymore. This was about justice. "Susan," I said that evening, "I need to speak with a lawyer. I know many of you watching have probably faced moments when the truth hit you like a ton of bricks. That moment when you realize someone you trusted completely has betrayed you in ways you never imagined. If you're finding this story resonates with your own experiences, please hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments. There's something healing about knowing we're not alone in these painful family situations." The next morning, I sat across from James Wilson in his law office. The documentation of Thomas's fraud spread across his desk. James had been Robert's attorney and had helped with our wills and estate planning. I trusted his discretion and expertise. "This is serious, Margaret," James said, examining the falsified investment document. "This isn't just a family dispute anymore. This is fraud, plain and simple." "What are my options?" I asked, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. James leaned back in his chair. "Well, the most straightforward approach would be to file criminal charges. With this evidence, Thomas would likely face serious consequences." The thought of my son in legal trouble, possibly even jail, made my stomach turn. Despite everything, he was still my child. "Is there another way?" I asked quietly. "Something that would hold him accountable without destroying his life completely?" James thought for a moment. "There might be. From what you've told me about the situation with Thomas's business, he's likely facing foreclosure on his business loans. The bank will sell those loans to recover what they can." "And?" I prompted. "And those loans could potentially be purchased by another party before they go into default. If that party were to acquire the debt, they would essentially own leverage over Thomas's business future." "You're suggesting I buy my son's debt?" The idea was shocking, but also strangely fitting. "It would give you options," James said carefully. "You could restructure the terms, demand certain concessions, or even forgive the debt entirely if certain conditions were met. It would put the control back in your hands." I sat with that thought for a long moment. How would this work practically? Wouldn't Thomas know I was the one buying his debt? Not necessarily. We could set up an LLC to make the purchase. Thomas would know someone had acquired his loans, but not who, at least initially. The plan began to take shape in my mind. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability, and perhaps about teaching my son the lesson I had clearly failed to instill during his upbringing. That actions have consequences, that loyalty matters, and that family is about more than financial convenience. "There's also the matter of the stolen funds," James continued. "That's a separate issue that needs to be addressed." "Could that be part of the negotiation if I acquire his debt?" I asked. James nodded. "It could indeed. It would give you another point of leverage." As I left James's office, my mind was racing with possibilities. The plan felt both terrifying and empowering. For decades, I had been the supportive mother, always putting Thomas's needs before my own. Now, for the first time, I was prioritizing justice, not just for myself, but for the values I had tried to instill in my son. That afternoon, Susan connected me with her son Ryan, who worked in real estate investment. Over coffee in Susan's kitchen, I explained the situation. "So you want to buy your son's business loan from the bank," Ryan summarized, "and use that as leverage to make him return your stolen funds and, what, apologize." "It's more complicated than that," I said. "I want Thomas to understand what he's done, not just to me, but to himself. He's lost his way, and I believe this might be the only way to reach him." Ryan looked skeptical. "This isn't exactly a conventional approach to family therapy, Mrs. Reynolds." "Conventional approaches haven't worked," I replied. "And please, call me Margaret." Over the next week, Ryan helped me understand the process of purchasing distressed debt. He explained how banks often sell troubled loans for less than their face value when they believe the borrower might default, preferring to recover some money immediately rather than risking getting nothing through a lengthy foreclosure process. The timing would be critical. We needed to approach the bank after they had classified Thomas's loan as troubled, but before they had begun formal foreclosure proceedings. Ryan had contacts who could help us monitor the situation. Meanwhile, James worked on establishing an LLC that would shield my identity. We called it Phoenix Recovery Services, a name I chose deliberately for its symbolism of rebirth from ashes. The financial aspects were next. I had substantial savings from the sale of my house, plus Robert's life insurance payout. Combined with my retirement accounts, minus the $50,000 Thomas had stolen, I had enough to purchase his business debt if the bank was willing to sell at a significant discount. As the practical details came together, I found myself wrestling with moral questions. Was I crossing a line? Was it wrong to use financial leverage against my own son, even if he had wronged me first? I called my sister Linda, who lived in Arizona. Linda had always been my moral compass, practical and direct but fundamentally kind. "He stole from you, Maggie," she said after I explained everything. "He threw you out of his house to make room for someone else. He chose money over family. I'd say you're well within your rights to teach him a lesson." "But is it the right thing to do?" I pressed. Linda sighed. The right thing would have been for Thomas to treat his mother with respect and gratitude. Since he didn't do the right thing, you're left with difficult choices. Just make sure whatever you do leaves the door open for reconciliation. He's still your son, and those children are still your grandchildren. Her words stayed with me as the plan progressed. I added a clause to the legal documents. Phoenix Recovery Services would have the option to forgive the debt entirely if certain conditions were met. This wasn't about destroying Thomas. It was about bringing him back to the values he once had. A week later, Ryan came to me with news. The bank has classified the loan as non-performing. They're preparing to sell it to a debt collection agency, but I've arranged a meeting for us to make an offer first. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I barely slept the night before, questioning and re-questioning my decision. By morning, I was resolved. This path might be unconventional, but it felt right, a way to address the wrongs while still leaving room for healing. At the bank, Ryan did most of the talking, presenting Phoenix Recovery Services as a new investment firm specializing in distressed debt. The bank representative, a middle-aged man named Mr. Pearson, seemed eager to offload the troubled loan. "Peterson Finance hasn't made a payment in 3 months," he explained. "Based on our investigation, they're in serious financial trouble. We've valued the outstanding debt at $300,000, but we're prepared to sell it for $180,000. Ryan countered with $150,000, citing the uncertain prospects of recovery. After some negotiation, we settled on $165,000. As I signed the documents, as the representative of Phoenix Recovery Services, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and resolve. This was not how I had imagined using my retirement savings, but sometimes life takes unexpected turns. "What happens now?" I asked Ryan as we left the bank. "Now we wait for the right moment," he said. "According to my sources, Thomas is scrambling to find financing to save his business. Let's give him a little more time to feel the pressure before we make our move." Through Barbara, I learned that things were indeed deteriorating at Thomas's house. There were more arguments, more late-night discussions, more visits from men in suits. Diane had fully moved in, apparently extending her financial support beyond what she had initially planned. "She looks worried," Barbara reported after seeing Diane at the local grocery store. "Not nearly as smug as when she first arrived." 2 weeks after acquiring the loan, James advised that it was time to act. The longer we wait, the more desperate Thomas might become. He could make rash decisions that would complicate matters. We decided that Phoenix Recovery Services would send a formal notice to Thomas, informing him that his loan had been purchased and requesting a meeting to discuss repayment options. The letter would not reveal my involvement, but would make it clear that the new owner of his debt was aware of certain irregularities in his business practices. As James's assistant delivered the letter to Thomas's office, I sat in Susan's living room, my hands shaking slightly as I sipped my tea. There would be no turning back now. The confrontation I had been both dreading and anticipating was finally set in motion. "Are you sure about this?" Susan asked gently. "No," I admitted. "But I'm sure that doing nothing isn't an option anymore." That evening, my phone rang. It was Thomas, his voice tense. "Mom, I need your help. There's a situation with the business, and I'm in trouble." The irony wasn't lost on me. After months of distance and dismissal, He was turning to me, but only because he needed something. What kind of trouble? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Financial trouble. It's complicated. Could we meet tomorrow? Maybe for coffee? Of course, I said, my heart racing despite my calm exterior. I'll always be there when you need me, Thomas. As I hung up, I wondered if he could hear the unspoken addition to that sentence. Unlike you, when I needed you. The next morning, I prepared carefully for my meeting with Thomas. I chose a navy blue dress that Robert had always said gave me an air of authority, styled my hair neatly, and put on my pearl earrings, a gift from Thomas on my 60th birthday, back when such gestures seemed genuine. Susan watched me with concerned eyes. Don't let him manipulate you, Margaret. Remember what he did. I won't forget, I promised, though part of me, the part that would always be a mother, was already searching for ways to help him out of his predicament without the harsh lesson I had planned. Thomas had suggested meeting at a small cafe downtown, away from both his office and his home. When I arrived, he was already there, looking haggard in a way I hadn't seen before. His normally immaculate suit was slightly rumpled, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. "Mom," he said, standing to greet me with a brief, awkward hug. "Thanks for coming." I ordered a cup of tea while Thomas fidgeted with his coffee cup, clearly struggling with how to begin. "You said you're in some financial trouble?" I prompted gently. Thomas exhaled heavily. "It's bad, Mom. Really bad. There was this development project, South Ridge. It was supposed to be a sure thing. Prime location, all the preliminary approvals lined up. I invested heavily, convinced my best clients to get in on it too. And something went wrong," I said, already knowing the answer. Everything went wrong. The environmental survey found an endangered species nesting on the property. Permits denied, project canceled, all the investment capital gone overnight. He ran a hand through his hair. "My father-in-law has washed his hands of the whole thing, saying I acted without proper authorization. The clients are threatening lawsuits. And now some investment firm has bought my business loans from the bank and is demanding immediate payment." "Phoenix Recovery Services," I said quietly. Thomas looked up sharply. "How did you know that?" I took a sip of my tea, buying a moment to choose my words. "I've been doing some research into your situation, Thomas." "Research? Why?" "Because despite how things ended between us, you're still my son, and I was concerned. This much was true, even if it wasn't the whole truth." Thomas seemed to deflate slightly. "Well, they're demanding a meeting tomorrow. If I can't work something out with them, I'll lose everything. The business, the house, everything." "Have you tried to find other financing?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from Ryan's reports. "I've tried everything. The banks won't touch me with the pending lawsuits. Stephanie's father refuses to help. Diane mortgaged her house to loan me money, but it's not nearly enough." He looked up, his expression a mixture of shame and desperation. "That's why I called you, Mom. I know it's a lot to ask after everything, but I was hoping you might be able to help." "What kind of help are you looking for, Thomas?" "A loan," he said quickly, "just until I can sort this out. You mentioned you had money from selling the house. I could pay you back with interest once the business recovers." I studied my son's face. There was genuine fear there, but also an entitlement that bothered me deeply. Even now, approaching me for financial help, he showed no recognition of the hurt he had caused, no acknowledgement of his betrayal. "Thomas," I said carefully, "before we discuss any financial arrangements, there's something I need to ask you about." He shifted uncomfortably. "What's that?" 4 months ago, $50,000 was transferred from my retirement account to your business, a transfer I never authorized." The color drained from Thomas's face. His eyes darted around the cafe as though looking for an escape route. "Mom, I can explain." "Please do," I said, my voice calm despite the anger rekindling inside me. "It was just a temporary loan," he stammered. "The South Ridge project needed more capital, and I was going to pay it back with the profits. I was trying to protect your investment too. I know you were looking for places to invest your money from the house sale. By forging my signature? By stealing from me?" Thomas flinched at the word stealing. "I didn't think of it that way. I was going to tell you once the project paid off, present it as a successful investment I'd made on your behalf. And when the project failed?" I pressed. He looked down at his coffee cup. I was trying to figure out how to make it right. The conversation was interrupted by Thomas's phone ringing. He glanced at the screen. "It's Stephanie. She's probably wondering how our talk is going." He declined the call but began texting rapidly. I watched him. This man who was my son yet seemed so far removed from the boy I had raised. He had stolen from me, lied to me, discarded me when I became inconvenient, and now sought my help without a genuine apology for any of it. In that moment, my resolve hardened. The plan would proceed. "Thomas," I said as he set down his phone, "I'll need some time to think about this. It's a lot to process." Relief flooded his face. He clearly interpreted my response as leaning toward helping him. "Of course, Mom. Take all the time you need. But the meeting with Phoenix is tomorrow at 2 p.m. I understand. I'll call you in the morning with my decision." As I drove back to Susan's house, I called James. "We're proceeding as planned. Thomas has no idea I'm behind Phoenix, and he's desperate enough that the leverage should work." James confirmed that all the legal paperwork was in order. Ryan had prepared a detailed repayment schedule that would be contingent on specific behavioral changes and accountability measures. That evening, I received a text from Barbara. "Diane's car has been parked at Thomas's all day, lots of raised voices earlier." I could imagine the scene. Thomas reporting on our meeting, Diane and Stephanie strategizing, perhaps even discussing how to convince me to give them money without addressing the underlying issues. The next morning, I received 3 calls from Thomas before 9 a.m. I let them go to voicemail, needing to maintain my resolve. His messages grew increasingly desperate. "Mom, just checking in about our conversation yesterday. Mom, the meeting with Phoenix is at 2. I really need to know if you can help. Mom, please call me back. I don't know what to do if you can't help us." At 10 a.m., I texted him, "I've made my decision. I'll see you at the Phoenix meeting." His reply was immediate. "What do you mean? The Phoenix meeting is private." "Not anymore," I responded. "I'll explain when I see you." At 1:45 p.m., Ryan, James, and I arrived at the address Phoenix Recovery Services had provided for the meeting, a conference room at James's law office. We waited silently as 2 p.m. approached. Thomas arrived precisely on time, looking confused when he saw me sitting at the table. "Mom, what are you doing here?" Before I could answer, James spoke. "Mr. Reynolds, please have a seat. I'm James Wilson, legal representative for Phoenix Recovery Services." Thomas sat slowly, his eyes moving between the 3 of us. "I don't understand." "Mom, what's going on?" Ryan placed a folder on the table. "Mr. Reynolds, my name is Ryan Cooper. I represent the investment interests of Phoenix Recovery Services." He slid the folder toward Thomas. "Inside, you'll find documentation confirming that Phoenix now owns the entirety of your business debt previously held by First National Bank." Thomas opened the folder, scanning the documents with growing confusion. "But what does this have to do with my mother being here?" James cleared his throat. "Phoenix Recovery Services is owned by Margaret Reynolds. Your mother is now, effectively, your creditor." The shock on Thomas's face would have been almost comical under different circumstances. He looked at me with wide eyes. You? You bought my debt? How? Why?" "I think you know why, Thomas," I said quietly. "You stole from me, then discarded me when I was no longer useful to you. When Diane offered financial support, I became expendable." "That's not fair," Thomas protested weakly. "The situation with Diane was complicated. So is this one," I replied. "Ryan, please explain the terms to Thomas." Ryan outlined the repayment plan we had developed, a structured schedule that would allow Thomas to save his business while making restitution for the stolen funds. The terms were strict but fair, certainly more lenient than what a typical debt collector would demand. "There are additional conditions," James added, turning to a specific page in the agreement. "Miss Reynolds requires full financial transparency going forward, including quarterly reviews of business practices. There will be no more risky investments without proper authorization. And most importantly, there are certain personal conditions." Thomas looked up from the papers. "Personal conditions?" "Family therapy," I said firmly. "You, me, Stephanie, and Diane. Weekly sessions for at least 6 months." Thomas's face flushed with anger. "This is extortion. You're using my financial situation to force your way back into my life." "No, Thomas," I corrected him. "I'm using the consequences of your own actions to hold you accountable. You have choices here. You can accept these terms, or Phoenix can begin foreclosure proceedings immediately. But regardless of what you choose, I expect the $50,000 you stole from me to be repaid in full." The reality of his situation seemed to dawn on him slowly. His shoulders slumped as the anger drained away, replaced by a dawning recognition. "I don't have a choice, do I?" he asked quietly. "You always have choices, Thomas," I replied. "Just as you had a choice when you decided to forge my signature. Just as you had a choice when you asked me to leave your home to make room for Diane. The difference is that now you'll have to live with the consequences of those choices." Thomas stared at the papers for a long moment before picking up the pen James had placed beside them. His hand hovered over the signature line. "What happens after I sign?" "We begin rebuilding," I said simply. "Not just your business, but our family. If that's still possible." Thomas signed the papers, his usual confident scrawl reduced to a shaky approximation. As he slid the documents back across the table, he couldn't quite meet my eyes. "I never meant for things to get this far," he said softly. "Neither did I replied, gathering my purse and standing. "The first therapy session is scheduled for Thursday at 4 p.m. I expect everyone to be there." As I walked out of the conference room, I felt no triumph, no vindication, only a weary hope that this painful intervention might somehow lead us back to being a family again. The day of our first family therapy session arrived with a weight of anticipation. I had chosen Dr. Eleanor Winters carefully, a family therapist with experience in complex family dynamics and financial conflicts. Her office was neutral territory, a peaceful space with comfortable seating and soft lighting. I arrived 15 minutes early, my nerves making it impossible to sit still at Susan's house any longer. Dr. Winters greeted me warmly. "Mrs. Reynolds, it's good to meet you in person. I've reviewed the summary you provided of the situation." I nodded. "Thank you for taking this on. I know it's unconventional." She smiled slightly. "Family dynamics often are. My job is to help navigate the complexity, not judge it." I settled into one of the armchairs, watching the clock anxiously as 4 p.m. approached. At 3:55, the door opened and Thomas entered, his expression guarded. He nodded stiffly in my direction, but chose a seat as far from me as possible. "Where are Stephanie and Diane?" I asked. Thomas checked his watch. "They're coming separately. Stephanie had to pick up the kids from school first and drop them with a neighbor." At 4:05, Stephanie arrived alone, her face tight with tension. "Diane isn't feeling well," she announced, avoiding looking at me directly. "She sends her apologies." Dr. Winters raised an eyebrow but simply made a note on her pad. "We'll proceed with those present then. Perhaps Mrs. Peterson can join us for the next session." I wasn't surprised by Diane's absence. I had expected resistance, especially from her. This was merely the first skirmish in what would likely be a lengthy campaign. Dr. Winters began by establishing ground rules. No interrupting, no personal attacks, focus on I statements rather than accusations. She then asked each of us to describe what we hope to achieve through these sessions. "I want my family back," I said simply. "Not as it was in recent months, but as it could be, built on mutual respect and genuine care." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "I want to resolve the financial situation and clear the air about certain misunderstandings." Stephanie's response was more defensive. "I'm here because we're required to be, as part of this financial agreement. I think this whole situation has been blown out of proportion." Dr. Winters nodded without judgment. "Let's start by having each of you describe your perspective on how we reached this point. Margaret, would you like to begin?" I took a deep breath and recounted my experience, from moving in temporarily after selling my house, to the gradual coldness, to being asked to leave to make room for Diane, and finally to discovering that Thomas had stolen from my retirement fund. As I spoke, Thomas's expression shifted between discomfort, defensiveness, and occasional flashes of what might have been shame. Stephanie stared at the floor, her arms crossed tightly. When I finished, Dr. Winters turned to Thomas. "Thomas, what's your perspective on these events?" Thomas cleared his throat. "I think there are some exaggerations in that account. Yes, we asked Mom to move out sooner than originally planned, but it was a practical decision, not a rejection. Diane's apartment was being renovated, and she needed somewhere to stay." "And was there no other option?" Dr. Winters asked. "No possibility of finding alternative arrangements for your mother-in-law?" Thomas hesitated. Diane has been very supportive of our family, especially financially. When the South Ridge project failed, she stepped in with a significant loan. We felt obligated. So this was about money, I said, unable to keep the hurt from my voice. It wasn't just about money, Thomas insisted. Diane has been an active grandmother to our children. She helps around the house, cooks meals the kids will actually eat. And I didn't, I interrupted, breaking Dr. Winter's no-interruption rule. I wasn't helpful enough to earn my place in your home? Dr. Winters raised a hand gently. Let's maintain our ground rules, Margaret. Thomas, please continue. Thomas sighed. Mom, you were always welcome to visit. We just needed the physical space for Diane. After I'd been living there for months, I pointed out. After I had sold my house with the understanding that I had time to find the right new place. We gave you 2 weeks' notice, Stephanie interjected, speaking for the first time. And Thomas gave you money to help with the transition. As though $5,000 could make up for being thrown out of my son's home, I replied. As though money could compensate for the betrayal. Betrayal is a strong word, Thomas said defensively. Is it? I asked. What would you call forging my signature to steal $50,000 from my retirement account? The room fell silent. Stephanie turned to Thomas, her expression shocked. You did what? Apparently, this detail had not been shared with her. Thomas's face flushed. It was a loan, he said weakly. I was going to pay it back as soon as the South Ridge project paid out. You stole from your own mother? Stephanie's voice had risen an octave. Thomas, you told me we were using Diane's money and our savings. Dr. Winters allowed the moment to unfold, recognizing the significance of this revelation. Thomas ran his hands through his hair. The business was going under. I was desperate. I made a mistake. A mistake? I echoed. Thomas, you committed fraud. You took advantage of my trust and stole my retirement money without my knowledge or consent. Is that why you bought his business debt? Stephanie asked me, her tone accusatory despite her apparent shock at Thomas's actions. To punish him? To hold him accountable, I corrected, and to protect myself. If Thomas was willing to steal from me once, what would stop him from doing it again? I needed leverage to ensure I got my money back. So this is all about money for you too, Thomas said bitterly. No, Thomas, I said firmly. If it were just about money, I would have pressed criminal charges for the fraud and been done with it. This is about trying to salvage our family relationship, which you seemed perfectly willing to discard when it became inconvenient. Dr. Winters intervened. I think we've uncovered an important dynamic here. There seems to be a pattern of using financial leverage within family relationships. Thomas and Stephanie accepted Diane's financial support, which created an obligation that ultimately displaced Margaret. Margaret, in turn, used financial means to create leverage over Thomas and Stephanie. It's not the same thing, I protested. Perhaps not in degree, Dr. Winters acknowledged, but the pattern is similar. Money has become a proxy for power and control within your family system. The observation hung in the air, uncomfortable but undeniably accurate. At that moment, the door opened, and Diane walked in. Her dramatic entrance suggested she had been waiting for the right moment. I apologize for my tardiness, she said, though her tone suggested anything but contrition. I was feeling unwell, but I decided this was too important to miss. Dr. Winters gestured to an empty chair. We're glad you could join us, Mrs. Peterson. We were just discussing the role of financial support in family dynamics. Diane settled into the chair beside Stephanie, patting her daughter's hand reassuringly. Well, that's certainly relevant. After all, I'm the one who mortgaged my home to save Thomas's business. And I appreciate your generosity, I said, struggling to keep my tone neutral. But did that generosity require me to be evicted from my son's home? Diane's smile was thin. Margaret, you were always meant to be a temporary guest. The arrangement had simply gone on longer than anyone anticipated. 3 months, I said. I had been there for 3 months when I was asked to leave, after being told I could stay for 6. Plan change, Diane replied dismissively. They certainly do, I agreed. Like my plan to leave my retirement savings intact before Thomas decided to borrow from it without my knowledge. Diane's eyes widened, and she turned to Thomas. Is this true? Thomas looked cornered now, with nowhere to hide. I made some decisions I'm not proud of, he admitted. The business was failing. Clients were threatening lawsuits, and I was desperate. So you stole from your mother? Diane asked incredulously. And then you asked her to leave your home, Dr. Winters added, to make room for the person offering financial support. The stark reality of what had happened hung in the air between us. For perhaps the first time, I saw Diane regard Thomas with something approaching disappointment rather than her usual adoration. I think, Dr. Winters said into the silence, this is a good moment to discuss what values you want your family to be built on moving forward. Not what has happened, but what kind of family you want to be. One where people aren't valued solely for their financial contributions, I said immediately. Stephanie looked up, her expression surprisingly vulnerable. One where we're honest with each other, even when it's difficult. One where mistakes can be acknowledged and forgiven, Thomas added quietly. Diane remained silent, her lips pressed together in a tight line. These are excellent starting points, Dr. Winters said. For our next session, I'd like each of you to reflect on specific actions you can take to embody these values. Not just intentions, but concrete behaviors that would demonstrate a commitment to change. As the session concluded, the tension in the room had shifted. It wasn't gone, far from it, but it had evolved from defensive hostility to a more contemplative discomfort. We had named truths that had been avoided for too long, and while naming them didn't solve anything, it created a foundation from which solutions might eventually emerge. In the parking lot afterward, Thomas approached me hesitantly. Mom, can we talk for a minute? Alone? Stephanie and Diane continued to their car, Diane casting a suspicious glance over her shoulder. Of course, I said, my heart racing slightly with anticipation. Thomas seemed to struggle for words. I've been thinking a lot since that meeting at James's office, about what happened with your retirement money. I need you to know that I never intended to steal from you. But you did, Thomas, I said gently. Intentions aside, that's what happened. He nodded, looking at the ground. I know. And I'm sorry. Really sorry. Not just because I got caught, but because you deserved better from me. After everything you did for me growing up, I repaid you by treating you as disposable. It was the first genuine apology I'd heard from him in months, maybe years. Something small but significant shifted between us. Thank you for saying that, I said softly. We have a long way to go, but this is a start. As I watched him walk to his car where Stephanie and Diane waited, I felt a cautious hope. The confrontation I had feared for so long had begun a process that might, eventually, lead to healing. Over the next month, our weekly therapy sessions continued, though not without challenges. Diane missed the second session entirely and arrived late to the third, her resistance plain in every tense smile and dismissive comment. Stephanie fluctuated between defensiveness and moments of genuine reflection. Thomas, somewhat to my surprise, seemed the most committed to the process, arriving prepared for each session with notes and reflections. During our fourth session, Dr. Winters focused on the practical aspects of rebuilding trust. Trust is earned through consistent actions over time, she explained. Words are important, but they must be backed by behavior. I've been thinking about that, Thomas said, opening his notebook. I've created a repayment schedule for Mom's retirement money, separate from the Phoenix agreement. Monthly payments, with interest, until the full amount is restored. He handed me a printed sheet with a detailed amortization schedule. The payments were modest but consistent, stretched over 3 years. I know it's not ideal, he said, but it's what I can manage right now while meeting the Phoenix obligations. I wanted to show that repaying you is a priority, not just a legal requirement. The gesture touched me. It wasn't the money itself. The Phoenix agreement already ensured I would recover the stolen funds. But the voluntary nature of the offer. The effort to make amends beyond what was legally required. Thank you, Thomas, I said. I appreciate this. Dr. Winters nodded approvingly. This is a good example of a concrete action that helps rebuild trust. What other areas need similar attention? Stephanie spoke up, somewhat hesitantly. I've been thinking about our living arrangements, about how quickly we asked Margaret to leave. She glanced at Diane, who stiffened visibly. I realize now that wasn't handled well. What would you do differently? Dr. Winters prompted. We should have given more notice, for one thing, Stephanie admitted, and been more transparent about why we needed the space. And, she hesitated again, we should have explored other options for Diane's housing needs. Diane's face flushed. I suppose I'm the villain in this story, she said sharply, The intruder who displaced the saintly mother. No one's casting you as a villain, Diane, Dr. Winters said calmly. We're trying to understand how family decisions were made and how they affected everyone involved. Well, I know when I'm not wanted, Diane replied. Perhaps I should find somewhere else to stay, since my presence is such a problem. Mom, that's not what anyone is saying, Stephanie protested. Isn't it? Margaret buys Thomas's debt to force me out of therapy sessions where everyone blames me for family problems that existed long before I moved in. I took a deep breath, recognizing the defensive reaction for what it was. Diane, I don't want you to leave Thomas and Stephanie's home. That's not what this is about. Then what is it about? She challenged. It's about finding a way for all of us to be part of the family without anyone being pushed aside, I said. It's about acknowledging that decisions were made that hurt me deeply, not just practically but emotionally. And you think I don't understand being hurt by family? Diane's voice cracked slightly. My own daughter barely spoke to me for years until she needed help with the children. I know what it's like to be kept at arm's length until you're useful. The revelation hung in the air. Stephanie looked away, uncomfortable with this unexpected disclosure. Perhaps, Dr. Winters suggested, there are more shared experiences here than anyone realized. Both grandmothers feeling valued primarily for their utility rather than their place in the family. It was a perspective I hadn't considered, that Diane's controlling behavior might stem from her own insecurities about her place in her daughter's life. It didn't excuse what had happened, but it helped me see her in a more human light. The sessions continued, gradually shifting from airing grievances to negotiating new boundaries and expectations. Thomas's business stabilized under the structured repayment plan Ryan had designed. He scaled back his ambitions, focusing on more conservative investments and rebuilding client trust through transparency and caution. By the third month, changes were evident not just in our therapy sessions but in daily interactions. Thomas called regularly, not just when he needed something. Stephanie sent photos of the children and invited me to Emily's school play, a small gesture that meant more than she could know. Most surprising was the gradual thaw between Diane and me. During our 6th therapy session, she admitted something I never expected to hear. I was jealous, she said quietly, of your relationship with Thomas. Stephanie and I, we've had our difficulties. I always envied how close you and Thomas seemed, even after he was grown. We were close, I agreed. Until recently, I think. Perhaps I contributed to that distance, Diane admitted. Not intentionally, but I may have. Reinforced certain boundaries that weren't mine to define. It wasn't a full apology, but from Diane, it was a significant concession. After that session, she suggested we have coffee together, just the two of us. At a small cafe downtown, away from Thomas and Stephanie's influence, we had our first real conversation. I'm not leaving their house, she said bluntly, stirring her latte. I've sold my place, and at my age, starting over isn't realistic. I'm not asking you to leave, I assured her. That's not what this is about for me. Then what do you want? She asked, her directness refreshing after months of careful diplomatic language in therapy. I want to be part of my son's life and my grandchildren's lives in a meaningful way, I said simply, not as an occasional visitor who's tolerated rather than welcomed. I want holidays and birthdays and ordinary Tuesdays sometimes. I want the children to know me as their grandmother, not just Grandma Margaret who sends presents at Christmas. Diane was quiet for a moment. I suppose there's room for 2 grandmothers, she said finally, as long as we're clear about territories. It wasn't perfect, but it was a beginning, an acknowledgement that we both had legitimate places in the family. The true test came at Thanksgiving, the first holiday since our therapy had begun. Thomas and Stephanie invited me to join them, and Diane, for dinner. I arrived with trepidation, bearing a pecan pie made from my mother's recipe. The initial awkwardness gradually gave way to something approaching normalcy as the meal progressed. Emily proudly showed me her school art project, while Jackson insisted I help him build a Lego tower after dinner. Thomas carved the turkey with his father's old carving set, a gift I'd given him years ago that I was surprised he'd kept. Most remarkable was watching Diane make room for me, literally and figuratively. When Emily wanted to sit between both her grandmothers, Diane moved her chair to accommodate without comment. When Jackson asked me to read him a bedtime story, Diane suggested I use the special voice for the dragon character, acknowledging my role in his bedtime routine. As I prepared to leave that evening, Thomas walked me to my car. "Thank you for coming, Mom," he said. "It meant a lot to all of us." "It meant a lot to me too," I replied, surprising myself by meaning it. "I've been thinking," he said, shuffling his feet slightly in a gesture reminiscent of his teenage years. "The house 2 doors down from us is going on the market next month. It's a small rancher, all one level, with a nice garden. I thought, maybe you'd like to take a look at it. If you're still looking for a place." The offer took my breath away. Not just the practical suggestion, but what it represented, a desire to have me near, to make me part of their daily lives again. "I'd like that very much," I said, my voice thick with emotion. As I drove back to Susan's house that night, I reflected on the journey of the past months. The transformation wasn't complete. There were still tense moments and old patterns that emerged under stress. But something fundamental had shifted. We were finding our way back to being a family, albeit a different one than before. The Phoenix had done its work, not just in rescuing Thomas's business, but in allowing a new kind of family relationship to rise from the ashes of the old one. 6 months after that first confrontational therapy session, I stood in the empty living room of my new home, the rancher 2 doors down from Thomas and Stephanie, just as Thomas had suggested. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating the freshly painted walls and newly refinished hardwood floors. "It's perfect," Susan declared, setting down a box labeled kitchen. "Close enough to be convenient, far enough for privacy." I smiled, running my hand along the countertop that separated the kitchen from the living area. "It feels right, a fresh start, but connected to family." The purchase had been straightforward, partly thanks to Ryan's help navigating the real estate process, partly because the Phoenix agreement had restored my financial stability. Thomas had been true to his word about the repayment schedule, never missing a payment despite the continued challenges with his scaled-down business. My phone chimed with a text message. It was Thomas. "Kids are asking when Grandma's house will be ready for cookies. No pressure, but we have chocolate chip dough ready to bake." I smiled at the casual warmth of the message. "Tell them the oven works," I replied. "Bring the dough over and we'll christen the kitchen properly." Within half an hour, the empty house was filled with the sounds of family. Emily's excited chatter about her science project, Jackson's running commentary on every feature of the new house, Stephanie's practical suggestions about furniture placement. Thomas moved between kitchen and living room, helping unpack boxes while simultaneously keeping an eye on the cookies in the oven. Most surprising was Diane's presence. She had arrived with the others, carrying a potted plant as a housewarming gift. "Every home needs something living and growing," she said, setting it on the windowsill. "It's a peace lily. They're nearly impossible to kill, which is good because I remember you saying you don't have the best track record with houseplants." The fact that she had remembered this small detail from a casual conversation months ago touched me more than the gift itself. As the children raced through the house, claiming spaces for future sleepovers, Diane and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen. "This is a good solution," she said, gesturing around at the house. "Close but separate. That seems to be our theme," I replied with a smile. She nodded, understanding my meaning. Over the past months, we had established a wary but functional relationship. We would never be close friends, but we had found a way to coexist as the grandmothers of the same children, each with our own role to play. The Christmas gathering that followed a month later further cemented our new family dynamic. Hosted at Thomas and Stephanie's house, it included not only Diane and me, but also my sister Linda, who had flown in from Arizona, and Susan, who had become an honorary family member after her support during my difficult months. As we exchanged gifts around the tree, I was struck by how far we had come. Thomas had given me a beautiful silver frame containing a professional family photo, all of us together, including Diane, taken the previous week. The thoughtfulness of the gift, acknowledging my place in the family portrait rather than excluding me as had happened before, brought tears to my eyes. Later, as the children played with their new toys and the adults settled into comfortable conversation, Thomas pulled me aside. "Mom, I've been wanting to talk to you about Phoenix." The business debt remained a background presence in our relationship. Though Thomas had never missed a payment under the agreement, the power dynamic it created was undeniably complex. "What about it?" I asked. "I've been thinking. It served its purpose, hasn't it? Brought us back together, made me face some hard truths. But I wonder if it's time to renegotiate. I studied my son's face, looking for signs of manipulation or entitlement, the qualities that had concerned me so deeply before. Instead, I saw genuine reflection. "What did you have in mind?" I asked carefully. "Not forgiveness of the debt," he clarified quickly. "I want to repay everything I owe, but maybe we could simplify the arrangement. Transfer it back to a regular bank loan, remove Phoenix from the equation entirely, make our relationship about family again, not creditor and debtor." I had considered this possibility myself in recent weeks. The Phoenix arrangement had been necessary at the time, a way to create leverage when all other avenues had failed. But now that trust was being rebuilt through other means, was it still needed? "I'd like that," I said. "James can draw up the paperwork after the holidays." Thomas's relief was palpable. "Thank you. It's been difficult, knowing that my relationship with my mother hinged on a legal agreement." "The agreement didn't create our relationship, Thomas," I said gently. "It just protected me while we rebuilt what was broken. The fact that we can move beyond it now is a sign of progress, not failure." He nodded, understanding. "I'm grateful for the wake-up call, as painful as it was. I was losing myself in pursuit of status and success, forgetting the values you taught me growing up." "We all lose our way sometimes," I said. "The important thing is finding our way back." Our conversation was interrupted by Jackson, who demanded that his father help assemble a particularly complicated toy. Thomas squeezed my hand before joining his son on the floor, amid a sea of plastic pieces and incomprehensible instructions. Watching them, I felt a deep contentment. The path to this moment had been unexpected and painful, but perhaps necessary. Sometimes relationships need to break apart completely before they can be rebuilt on a stronger foundation. Diane caught my eye from across the room and raised her glass slightly in acknowledgement. We would never be best friends, but we had reached an understanding that allowed both of us to be fully present in the lives of the people we loved. As the evening drew to a close, with Emily falling asleep against my shoulder and Jackson fighting valiantly against drooping eyelids, I reflected on the journey of the past year. From the rainy night I had stood locked out of my son's house, through the painful revelations and confrontations, to this moment of genuine family connection. The betrayal had been real and the hurt profound, but healing had come, not through forgetting or minimizing the pain, but through acknowledging it, addressing its causes, and deliberately choosing a different path forward. "You know," Thomas said quietly as we watched Stephanie tuck the children into bed, "I never expected things to turn out this way when you first told me you were Phoenix." "Neither did I admitted. "I was prepared for a much longer battle." "I'm glad it didn't come to that," he said. "Having you back in our lives, having you close by, it feels right, Mom. Like we found our way home after being lost for a while." Home, not a physical place, but a constellation of relationships, boundaries, and mutual respect. We had all been searching for it, each in our own way. Thomas through status and success, Stephanie through creating the perfect family image, Diane through controlling her environment, and me through reclaiming my place in my son's life. In the end, we had found it not in dominance or exclusion, but in making room for each other, in acknowledging both the hurt we had caused and our capacity for growth and change. As I settled into my new home that night, I felt a profound gratitude for the journey, difficult as it had been. Sometimes the most unexpected paths lead us exactly where we need to go. I never imagined sharing a story like this, but I hope it resonates with some of you who might be going through similar family struggles. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that even the deepest family wounds can heal with time, effort, and honest communication. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to take drastic steps to rebuild a broken family relationship? What worked for you? Please like this video if you found my story helpful. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more family journey stories. And share it with someone who might need to hear that family reconciliation is possible, even after betrayal. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember, sometimes the hardest family lessons lead to the most meaningful transformations.